5 years of silence, one knock at the door, and the sister of the woman who destroyed him standing on his porch with 3 words that would shatter everything. I forgive you. Ethan Cole thought he'd buried his past along with his marriage, until the night Marion Hale appeared at his ranch gate, carrying secrets that would unravel 5 years of carefully constructed solitude. What she reveals will force him to confront the truth he never knew, feel emotions he thought were dead, and face a connection so forbidden it could destroy them both. Or save them. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The dust settled slowly in the evening light, hanging in the air like memories that refused to fade. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, the other resting against the weathered wooden post that had held up this structure for longer than he'd been alive. The California hills rolled out before him in waves of golden grass, touched now with the amber glow of a sun that was taking its time to die. 5 years. 5 years since he'd heard her voice. 5 years since the door had closed with that terrible final softness that was somehow worse than any slam could have been. 5 years since Rebecca had walked out of his life without explanation, leaving behind only the ghost of what they'd built together and the haunting question of why. He'd stopped asking that question sometime during the 3rd year, stopped turning it over in his mind like a stone he could eventually see through if he just held it up to the light at the right angle. Some questions, he'd learned, didn't have answers. Or if they did, those answers were buried so deep that digging for them would only tear open old wounds that had finally, mercifully, begun to scar over. The ranch had been his salvation. 200 acres of solitude, far enough from town that he could go days without seeing another soul if he chose to, and he often chose to. The cattle didn't ask questions. The horses didn't need explanations. The land didn't care about the hollowness that had taken up residence in his chest, right behind his ribs, in the space where hope used to live. Ethan was 42 now, though some mornings he felt twice that. The years alone had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before, brackets around his mouth, creases at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he squinted against the sun. His dark hair had begun to show threads of silver at the temples. His hands were rougher, more calloused. He'd lost weight in the first year, then slowly rebuilt muscle through the hard work of keeping the ranch running single-handedly. He looked like what he was, a man who'd learned to survive without softness. The coffee mug was halfway to his lips when he saw it, a plume of dust rising from the access road that connected his property to the county highway. A vehicle, moving slowly, deliberately. Ethan lowered the mug, his jaw tightening. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. The truck that emerged from the dust was unfamiliar, a dark blue Chevy, at least a decade old, with a spare tire mounted on the back and a layer of road grime that suggested a long journey. It slowed as it approached the gate, and for a moment Ethan thought it might turn around. Visitors who made it this far often did, realizing they'd come to the wrong place or losing their nerve. But this truck didn't turn around. It stopped at the gate, idling there as if the driver was gathering courage. Ethan set his mug down on the porch railing and descended the steps slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. He was halfway to the gate when the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Even from 30 yards away, Ethan could see she was young, late 20s, maybe early 30s. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, dusty from travel. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with a kind of careful grace, like someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible in the world. Something about her was familiar. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stopping him mid-stride. The shape of her face, the way she held her shoulders, the particular shade of her eyes, even at this distance, a deep brown that was almost black in certain light. He knew those eyes. He'd once loved someone with those exact eyes. "Can I help you?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by surprise, and something darker. Something that tasted like old fear. The woman approached the gate but didn't open it, didn't presume. She stopped on the other side of the metal bars, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Ethan Cole?" He nodded once, sharp and wary. "My name is Marion Hale." She paused, and in that pause, the world seemed to contract. I'm Rebecca's sister. The ground tilted beneath him. Ethan felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, an involuntary response to the surge of adrenaline that flooded his system. Rebecca's sister. He hadn't known she had a sister. In all their years together, Rebecca had never mentioned family beyond her parents, both long dead. Never spoke of siblings or cousins or anyone who might care what happened to her. Another secret. Another piece of the puzzle he'd given up trying to solve. What do you want? The words came out hard, defensive. He saw Marion flinch slightly, but she held her ground. I came to talk to you. She drew in a breath and he watched her fingers curl around one of the gate's bars, knuckles going white. I came to forgive you. And her. Forgive him? Forgive him for what? The anger that rose in his throat was immediate and burning. He'd spent 5 years being the one left behind, the one discarded without explanation, the one who'd done everything right and still ended up alone. And now this stranger, this ghost from a past he'd barely known existed, was standing at his gate talking about forgiveness as if he were the one who needed it. I don't need your forgiveness, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't do anything wrong. Marion's expression shifted, something like sadness moving across her features. I know, she said quietly. That's why I'm here. The words hung in the air between them, making no sense and perfect sense all at once. Ethan stared at her, this woman who had Rebecca's eyes but not Rebecca's hardness, who stood before him offering something he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted. The sun was almost gone now, the sky bleeding out in shades of purple and gold. In the growing darkness, Marion looked even younger, more vulnerable. She was shivering slightly, though whether from cold or nerves, he couldn't tell. Every instinct told him to send her away, to tell her that whatever she'd come here to do, he wasn't interested, that the door on that chapter of his life was closed and locked and buried under 5 years of deliberate forgetting. But there was something in her eyes, a desperation, maybe, or a kind of courage that reminded him of things he used to value. And beneath the anger, beneath the defensive walls he'd built brick by careful brick, there was something else. Something that had been dormant for so long he'd almost forgotten its name. Curiosity. How did you find me? He asked. It wasn't hard. Marion's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Small town. Everyone knows where the recluse lives. Despite himself, despite everything, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Recluse. Is that what they called him? He supposed it was accurate enough. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Ethan could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could open the gate, or he could turn around and walk away. He could let this woman into his carefully controlled world, or he could keep it sealed tight. It's getting dark, Marion said, and there was no manipulation in her voice, no attempt to leverage the situation, just a simple statement of fact. I have a room in town. I can come back tomorrow if that's better. Or not at all, if that's what you prefer. She trailed off, her grip on the gate loosening. I just needed you to know I was here, that I tried. She turned to go, and Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. Wait. The word left his mouth before his brain had fully authorized it. Marion stopped, turned back, hope flickering across her face. Ethan moved to the gate and pulled it open, the metal hinges creaking in protest. You came all this way, he said gruffly. Might as well come inside. The house looked different with another person in it. Ethan noticed it immediately as he held the door open for Marion to enter. The space that had felt perfectly adequate for one suddenly felt too small, too sparse, too obviously the domain of someone who'd stopped caring about appearances. The furniture was functional but minimal. A couch he'd bought from a secondhand store, a coffee table scarred with water rings, a bookshelf overflowing with agricultural manuals, and Louis L'Amour novels. The kitchen was worse. Clean, yes. He kept everything clean, found something meditative in the ritual of washing dishes, wiping counters, sweeping floors, but empty in a way that spoke volumes. No fruit bowl on the counter, no magnets on the refrigerator, no signs that anyone had cooked a real meal here in years. Coffee? he offered, because it was the only thing he knew how to make that qualified as hospitality. Thank you. Marian stood in the center of the living room, hands clasped in front of her, looking like she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to sit down. You can... Ethan gestured awkwardly at the couch. Sit, or whatever. She sat, perching on the edge of the cushion with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Ethan escaped to the kitchen, grateful for something to do with his hands. He poured out the cold coffee from earlier and started a fresh pot, listening to the familiar gurgle and hiss of the machine. Through the doorway, he could see Marian's profile as she looked around the room, taking in the details of his life. What did she see? A man who'd given up on joy? A space stripped of everything that might hurt? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 mugs and carried them into the living room. He handed one to Marian and settled into the armchair across from her, maintaining distance. Safe distance. So, he said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. You're Rebecca's sister. Half-sister, Marian corrected gently. Same mother? Different fathers? I'm quite a bit younger. Rebecca was already out of the house by the time I was old enough to really know her. That explained why Rebecca had never mentioned her. Ethan took a sip of coffee, using the time to study the woman across from him more carefully. Now that they were inside, in the light, he could see the similarities and differences more clearly. She had Rebecca's eyes, yes, and something of the same bone structure. But where Rebecca had been all sharp edges and defensive angles, Marian was softer, gentler. There was a kindness in her face that Rebecca had either lost or never possessed. Why now? The question came out blunt, almost aggressive. It's been 5 years. Why show up now? Marian set her coffee mug down on the table with careful precision. Because I only found out about you 2 months ago. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Rebecca and I... Marian paused, choosing her words carefully. We weren't close. After our mother died, we sort of drifted apart. Different lives, different paths. I was living in Oregon, working as a teacher. She was here in California. We'd talk maybe once a year, if that. Awkward phone calls where we'd run out of things to say after 10 minutes. She picked up the coffee mug again, wrapping both hands around it like she needed the warmth. 2 months ago, I was cleaning out some boxes from my mother's storage unit, things I'd been putting off dealing with for years. I found letters, dozens of them, letters Rebecca had written but never sent. Ethan's heart began to pound harder in his chest. Letters to who? To you. Marian's eyes met his, and he saw something there that looked like pain, sympathy. Letters she wrote over the course of 5 years. Letters explaining everything. The room seemed to tilt. Ethan gripped the arm of his chair, his knuckles going white. Explaining what? Marian set her coffee down again and reached for her bag, which she'd placed on the floor beside the couch. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. Perhaps 24 envelopes, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting he recognized immediately. Rebecca's handwriting, precise and slightly angular, leaning to the right. She asked me to bring these to you, Marian said softly, in one of the last letters. She said if anything ever happened to her, she wanted you to know the truth. Ice flooded through Ethan's veins. Is she? She's alive, Marian said quickly, seeing his alarm. As far as I know, but we haven't spoken in over a year. I tried to find her before coming here, to ask her if this was really what she wanted, but she's moved, changed her number, cut ties completely. She held out the bundle of letters, and Ethan stared at them like they might burn him. All these years he'd believed that Rebecca left without looking back, without a second thought, without regret. The idea that she'd been writing to him all this time, that there were explanations waiting, answers to questions he'd forced himself to stop asking, it was too much. I can't, he said, his voice rough. I can't do this. I understand. Marian didn't withdraw the letters, but she didn't push them closer either. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to come here. I rewrote what I was going to say to you probably 50 times, almost turned around 6 times on the drive. Why didn't you? Because she was suffering, Marian said simply. In those letters, I could feel it pouring off the page. And I thought maybe you were suffering too. I thought maybe you both deserved to stop. Ethan stood abruptly, turning away from her, from the letters, from the weight of everything this meant. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkness that had fully claimed the land now. His reflection stared back at him, a man who looked older than his years, harder than he'd ever meant to be. "You don't know anything about what I deserve," he said, but there was no real anger in it, just exhaustion. "You're right," Marion agreed. "I don't. But I know what it's like to carry questions that eat at you. I know what it's like to wonder if things could have been different if you'd just known the truth." He heard her stand, heard her footsteps as she crossed the room to stand beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't invade his space, just stood there, close enough that he could sense her presence. "Rebecca loved you," she said quietly. "That much is clear in every word she wrote. She loved you so much it terrified her." "Then why did she leave?" The question burst out of him with 5 years of force behind it. 5 years of silence and speculation and slowly hardening scar tissue. 5 years of telling himself it didn't matter, that he'd moved on, that he was better off alone. All lies. All of it lies. Marion was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She was pregnant. The world stopped. Ethan turned to stare at her, and Marion's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You were going to have a baby," she continued. "Rebecca was 3 months along when she lost it. Miscarriage. The doctor said it sometimes happens, no real explanation, just one of those tragic things. But Rebecca, she couldn't accept it. She convinced herself it was her fault, that she'd done something wrong, been something wrong. She spiraled into a depression so deep she couldn't see daylight." Ethan's legs felt weak. He reached out, gripping the window frame to steady himself. "I didn't know. She never told me. We never—" "She hadn't told you yet about the pregnancy," Marion said. "She was waiting for the right moment, planning this whole special way to break the news. And then it was gone, and she felt like she'd lost something she never had the chance to give you. The guilt destroyed her." He could barely breathe. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy. "But why leave? Why not tell me? Why not let me help her?" "Because she thought she was protecting you," Marion's voice cracked. "She thought her pain would drag you down with her, that you'd be better off without her darkness. So she left before you could see how broken she was, before her grief could become your grief." The words hit him like bullets, each one finding its mark in places he'd thought were numb. A baby. They'd been going to have a baby, and Rebecca had lost it, had carried that loss alone, had let it drive her away rather than let him share the burden. All this time, he'd been angry at her for leaving. All this time, he'd thought she'd abandoned him out of selfishness or cruelty or simple indifference. The truth was so much worse, so much more painful. She'd left because she loved him too much to let him drown with her. "I need—" Ethan's voice broke. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I need some air." He moved toward the door, but Marion's voice stopped him. "The letters," she said. "She explains it all better than I can. Everything she felt, everything she went through. It's all there, in her own words." Ethan looked back at the bundle still sitting on the arm of the couch. Part of him wanted to burn them unread, to refuse the knowledge they contained, to keep the past safely locked away where it couldn't hurt him anymore. But that was a coward's choice, and whatever else he'd become in these 5 years of solitude, he wasn't a coward. "Leave them," he said. I'll read them, but not tonight." Marion nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I should go. Let you process all of this." "Where are you staying?" "The inn in town. The Maplewood?" He knew it. Small place, clean but basic. "That's 30 miles. I don't mind the drive." But it was dark now, and the roads between here and town were winding and poorly lit. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of obligation settling on his shoulders. He wasn't ready for this. Wasn't ready for any of it. But he also wasn't the kind of man who sent a woman out onto dark roads alone when he had space to offer. "The spare room," he heard himself say. "It's not much, but it's better than driving tonight. You can head back in the morning." Marion's expression softened with something like gratitude. "Are you sure?" No. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. The foundations of his carefully constructed life had just been shaken to their core. But he nodded anyway. "I'm sure. Update. The spare room had been Rebecca's office once. Ethan had cleared it out in the first year after she left, boxing up her things and storing them in the attic where he wouldn't have to see them every day. Now it held a bed, a dresser, and little else. Clean sheets that smelled like the cedar chest where he kept them. A window that looked out over the western pasture. He showed Marian to the room, pointed out the bathroom down the hall, told her to help herself to anything she needed. She thanked him with that same soft sincerity, and he fled before the walls could close in any further. In his own bedroom, the bedroom he'd once shared with Rebecca, though he'd replaced every piece of furniture since she left, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and dropped his head into his hands. The bundle of letters was still in the living room, waiting. Patience they'd had 5 years to develop. A baby. The thought kept circling back, refusing to be dismissed. He tried to imagine it. Rebecca pregnant, her body changing to accommodate new life. Had she been happy when she first found out? Scared? Had she touched her stomach and wondered if they were having a boy or a girl? Had she imagined their future, the three of them, before it all came crashing down? And when she lost it, God, when she lost it, had she cried? Had she screamed? Had she curled up in some hospital bed or bathroom floor, alone with her grief because she couldn't bear to share it? The pain of it was almost unbearable. Ethan had spent 5 years being angry, 5 years building walls, 5 years convincing himself that he was better off alone, that needing nobody was the same as being strong. But sitting here now in the dark, he felt those walls beginning to crack. Because the truth was worse than any scenario he'd imagined. The truth was that Rebecca had loved him enough to break both their hearts trying to save his, and he hadn't been there to stop her. He didn't remember deciding to stand up, didn't remember walking back to the living room. But suddenly he was there, the bundle of letters in his hands, the blue ribbon falling away as he untied it with trembling fingers. The first envelope was dated 6 months after Rebecca left. He pulled out the letter, 3 pages, front and back, covered in her precise handwriting. Dear Ethan, I don't know if I'll ever send this. I don't know if I have the right to. But the therapist I've started seeing says I should write down what I'm feeling, and the only person I want to talk to is you. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate. I know sorry doesn't begin to cover what I've done, but it's the only word I have that comes close. Do you remember that morning in March? You made pancakes because I said I was craving them, even though you hate making pancakes because you always burn the first batch. You sang while you cooked, some old country song you didn't know all the words to. I sat at the table and watched you and thought, this is happiness. This is what it feels like. I was going to tell you that day. I was going to tell you about the baby. I had it all planned out. I'd bought this tiny pair of booties, yellow, because we didn't know yet if it was a boy or girl. I was going to hide them in your coffee mug so you'd find them when you went to pour your second cup. But I never got the chance. Ethan's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing himself to keep reading. The cramps started that afternoon. I told you I wasn't feeling well and went to lie down. I told myself it was nothing. Normal pregnancy symptoms. But I knew. Somewhere deep inside, I knew. By the time I got to the hospital, it was over. They did an ultrasound to confirm, and the screen that should have shown life showed nothing, just emptiness, just the absence of what should have been. The doctor was kind. She said it happens to 20% of pregnancies. She said it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done differently. But all I could think was that I'd failed. I'd failed you. I'd failed our baby. I'd failed at the one thing women's bodies are supposed to do. I couldn't tell you. Every time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell someone you love that you lost something precious before they even knew it existed? How do you share a grief that's already consumed you? So I left instead. I know that makes me a coward. I know it makes me cruel. But I couldn't bear to see you look at me and know what I'd cost us. I couldn't bear to watch my pain become your pain. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was doing the noble thing. I was wrong. The letter went on, but Ethan had to stop, had to set it down and press the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to hold back the pressure building there. 5 years. She'd carried this alone for 5 years, and he'd been angry. He'd been bitter. He'd let resentment harden into indifference because he didn't know. He couldn't read anymore. Not tonight. But he couldn't stop either. The second letter was from a year later. Then another at 18 months. each one a window into Rebecca's unraveling and slow, painful reconstruction. She wrote about therapy, about medication, about the dark days when getting out of bed felt impossible, and the better days when she could go hours without thinking about what she'd lost. She wrote about seeing children at the grocery store and having to leave her cart in the middle of the aisle because she couldn't breathe. She wrote about the dreams where she held their baby, only to wake up to empty arms. She wrote about the guilt of moving forward, of healing, of finding moments of happiness when she felt like she didn't deserve them. And she wrote about him, always about him. I saw you yesterday. I know I shouldn't have. I know it's not fair to you, that part of moving forward means letting go, but I was in town and I couldn't help myself. I drove by the ranch just to see if you were okay. You were fixing the fence in the south pasture. I parked far enough away that you wouldn't notice. You looked... God, Ethan, you looked good. Tired, maybe. A little thinner than I remember, but strong, capable, alive. You were wearing that blue flannel shirt I bought you for your birthday 3 years ago. The one you said was too nice for ranch work. Seeing you in it made my chest ache. I wanted to get out of the car, wanted to walk up to you and say all the things I should have said before I left. But I'm still too broken. Still too much of a mess. You deserve better than what I am right now. Maybe someday I'll be whole enough to face you. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to tell you the truth. Until then, I'll keep writing these letters. Keep pretending that somehow, across the distance, you can hear what I'm trying to say. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m. when Ethan finally set the last letter down. His eyes burned. His throat was raw. He felt hollowed out, excavated by grief that wasn't even fresh, grief that had been aging like wine for 5 years, gaining complexity and depth. But beneath the pain, there was something else, something that felt almost like relief, because he finally understood. After 5 years of questions, 5 years of blanks he couldn't fill in, 5 years of creating stories to explain what had happened, he finally knew the truth. Rebecca hadn't stopped loving him. She'd never stopped. She'd loved him so much that she'd thought leaving was the answer. And she'd been wrong, but her wrongness came from a place of such deep care that he couldn't hold on to his anger anymore. It had nowhere to go, nowhere to live. A sound from the hallway made him look up. Marion stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket from the spare room. Her hair was down now, falling past her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable. "I heard you moving around," she said quietly. "Couldn't sleep either." Ethan looked down at the letters scattered around him. Evidence of heartbreak laid bare. "I read them all." "All of them?" Marion's eyes widened. "Ethan, I had to know." He scrubbed a hand over his face, feeling the stubble there, the exhaustion that went bone deep. "I had to know what happened." Marion moved into the room slowly, settling into the chair across from him, the same chair she'd occupied hours ago, in what felt like another lifetime. "How are you feeling?" How was he feeling? The question seemed impossibly large. He felt angry and sad and relieved and devastated all at once. He felt like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't know was there, and someone had just lifted it off his shoulders, only to replace it with a different weight, one that was somehow both heavier and lighter at the same time. "I don't know," he admitted. "Ask me tomorrow." A small smile touched Marion's lips. "Fair enough?" They sat in silence for a moment, and Ethan found himself studying her again. This woman who'd driven however many miles to deliver truth to a stranger, this woman who'd taken on her sister's burden and carried it here, to his door. "Why did you really come?" he asked. "You said it was to forgive us, but that's not the whole truth, is it?" Marion's smile faded. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "No," she admitted. "It's not." "So what's the real reason?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Because I read those letters, and I saw how much pain you both were in. How much time you'd wasted being miserable when you could have been helping each other heal, and I thought..." She paused, swallowed hard. "I thought maybe if I could give you the truth, you could stop punishing yourself, both of you." "You think Rebecca's punishing herself?" "I know she is." Marion's eyes came back to his, and there was a fierceness there he hadn't seen before. "She ran away from the best thing in her life because she couldn't forgive herself for something that wasn't her fault. If that's not self-punishment, I don't know what is." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Do you know where she is? No. Like I said, she's disappeared, cut all ties. But you tried to find her. Of course I did. Marian's voice rose slightly, passion bleeding through. She's my sister. Broken as our relationship might be, she's still family. I wanted to tell her I found you, that I was bringing you the letters. I wanted to give her the choice of whether this was really what she wanted. But you came anyway, even without her permission. Marian met his gaze steadily. Because I think she's been waiting for someone to make the choice she can't make herself, to take the decision out of her hands. She's been drowning for 5 years, Ethan. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone who's drowning is pull them to shore, even if they fight you the whole way. There was something in her voice, a personal note that made Ethan think she wasn't just talking about Rebecca anymore. He wanted to ask, wanted to understand this woman who'd inserted herself into his life with such determination. But it was late, and he was emotionally exhausted, and some questions needed daylight to be properly asked. You should get some sleep, he said instead. Morning comes early, on a ranch. Marian nodded, but she didn't move immediately. Ethan, I know this is a lot. I know it changes everything and nothing all at once. But for what it's worth, I think you deserve to know. I think you both deserve better than what you got. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. For bringing them, for coming all this way, for... He gestured vaguely at the letters, at the truth they contained. For this. She stood, the blanket trailing behind her like a cape. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. She loved you, Ethan. In case that got lost in all the pain and regret. She loved you completely. I know, he said quietly. I loved her too. Marian nodded and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, he heard the soft click of the spare room door closing. Ethan sat alone in the living room, surrounded by letters and the ghosts they'd conjured. Outside, the night was absolute. No moon, no stars visible through the clouds that had rolled in. The kind of darkness that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. But he wasn't alone anymore. Whether he wanted it or not, whether he was ready for it or not, the past had caught up with him, and with it had come Marian, Rebecca's sister, his unexpected messenger, a woman who'd walked into his carefully controlled solitude and cracked it wide open. He gathered the letters carefully, retying them with the blue ribbon. They felt heavier now, weighted with knowledge. He carried them to his bedroom and set them on the dresser, where he'd see them first thing in the morning, because this wasn't over. Reading the letters had answered some questions, but it had created new ones, questions about what came next, about whether forgiveness was possible after so much pain, about whether understanding the past could change anything about the present. Ethan lay down on his bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible, but his body was exhausted, and eventually, despite everything, his eyes began to close. His last thought before darkness claimed him was of Marian's face when she'd said she was here to forgive him and Rebecca both. The determination in her eyes. The courage it must have taken to knock on a stranger's door carrying truth like a loaded gun. She was braver than he'd been, braver than Rebecca had been. Maybe, he thought, as sleep pulled him under, that's exactly what they both needed. Someone brave enough to force them to face what they'd been running from. Someone brave enough to believe that broken things could still be made whole. Morning arrived with the kind of harsh clarity that made pretending impossible. Ethan woke to sunlight streaming through windows he'd forgotten to cover, his body stiff from sleeping in his clothes, his mind already racing before his eyes were fully open. The letters. Marian, Rebecca. The baby that never was. For a moment he considered staying in bed, pulling the covers over his head and retreating back into unconsciousness where none of this had to be real. But the cattle needed feeding, the horses needed tending, and somewhere down the hall was a woman who'd driven hundreds of miles to upend his carefully constructed life. He couldn't hide from any of it. The shower was scalding, the way he liked it, hot enough to turn his skin red and chase away the fog in his head. He stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting the water beat against his shoulders, trying to wash away the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a towel with steam billowing around him, he could hear sounds from the kitchen. the clink of mugs, the smell of coffee. Marian had made herself at home. He dressed quickly, jeans, a work shirt, boots worn soft from years of use, and made his way toward the kitchen. He found her standing at the stove, her back to him, scrambling eggs in his cast-iron skillet. She'd found an apron somewhere, tied it around her waist over the same clothes she'd worn yesterday. Her hair was still damp from her own shower, leaving dark spots on the back of her blouse. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "I'm not good at sitting still, and you didn't have much in the fridge, but I found eggs and some bread that wasn't too stale." "You didn't have to do that." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by last night's reading and this morning's reckoning. "I know." She glanced over her shoulder, offering him a small smile. "But I wanted to. Consider it payment for the room." Ethan moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a mug, black and strong. He leaned against the counter, watching her work. She moved efficiently in his kitchen, comfortable in a space that should have been foreign to her. It reminded him of Rebecca in some ways, that same practical competence. But where Rebecca's movements had always carried attention, Marian seemed more at ease in her own skin. "How'd you sleep?" she asked, dividing the eggs onto 2 plates. "I didn't." He took a sip of coffee, felt the burn all the way down. "Much." "Me neither." She carried the plates to the small kitchen table, gesturing for him to sit. Kept thinking about everything, about the letters, about what happens now. That was the question, wasn't it? What happened now? Ethan sat across from her, staring down at eggs he wasn't sure he could eat. His stomach felt tight, knotted with emotions he hadn't fully processed yet. "I read all of them," he said after a moment. "Every single letter." Marian's fork paused halfway to her mouth. That must have been devastating. He looked up, met her eyes. And clarifying, and confusing. All of it at once. She set her fork down, giving him her full attention. "Do you want to talk about it?" Did he? Ethan wasn't sure. For 5 years, he'd kept everything locked down tight, not talking about Rebecca, or the marriage, or why it ended. The few friends he still had in town had learned not to ask. The silence had become his armor, his protection against pain. But Marian already knew the worst of it. She'd read the letters too, had carried them across state lines. There was no point in pretending with her. "She thought she was protecting me," he said slowly, turning the coffee mug in his hands. "By leaving. She thought her grief would destroy us both, so she left before it could, before I could see how broken she was." "And how does that make you feel?" The question was gentle, not pushing. Therapist-like, actually, which made him wonder if teaching wasn't Marian's only profession, or maybe compassion was just her nature. "Angry," he admitted, not at her, at the situation, at the fact that she felt like she had to carry that alone, at myself for not seeing it, for not pushing harder when I knew something was wrong. He paused, the words catching in his throat. "At a universe that takes babies from people who want them." Marian reached across the table, her hand covering his. The gesture was simple, uncomplicated. Just human contact, one person to another. He didn't pull away. "You couldn't have known," she said quietly. "She made sure you couldn't know. That's not your fault." "Isn't it?" The bitterness in his voice surprised him. "I was her husband. I should have seen it. Should have known something that significant was happening. What kind of partner doesn't notice their wife is falling apart? The kind whose wife is an expert at hiding." Marian's grip tightened slightly on his hand. "Ethan, I barely knew Rebecca, but even from a distance, I could tell she was someone who'd rather die than show weakness. She was good at compartmentalizing, at putting on whatever face the situation required. If she didn't want you to see her pain, you weren't going to see it." He knew she was right. Rebecca had always been self-contained, self-sufficient, almost to a fault. It was one of the things he'd loved about her strength, her independence. He'd never realized how much of that strength was actually armor, how much of her independence was actually isolation. "The baby," he started, then had to stop, had to breathe through the tightness in his chest. In the letters, she wrote about what she thought it would be like. The nursery we'd build, teaching them to ride, all these little moments she'd imagined. "I know." Marian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That was the hardest part to read. The hope in those early letters before everything fell apart. "Did she ever Ethan had to force the words out. Did she ever try to have another child? With someone else? The question hurt to ask, but he needed to know, needed to understand if the loss had been so devastating that Rebecca had closed that door forever, or if she'd found a way to move forward. Marian shook her head slowly. Not that I know of. She's been alone as far as I can tell. No relationships, no attempts to build a new life, just existing, going through the motions. The thought of Rebecca trapped in that kind of half-life made his heart ache. Whatever anger he'd carried toward her over the years dissolved completely in the face of that image. She hadn't moved on, hadn't found happiness elsewhere. She'd just been surviving, carrying her grief like stones in her pockets. I want to find her, he said suddenly, the decision forming even as he spoke it. I want to talk to her. Tell her I know. Tell her it's okay. Marian's expression shifted, something complicated moving across her features. Hope, maybe, mixed with concern. Ethan, I don't know if that's possible. Like I said, she's cut all ties, changed her number, her address. She doesn't want to be found. There has to be a way. He pulled his hand back, needing the movement, the action. You found me. Someone must know where she is. I found you because you stayed in one place. You put down roots, built a life here. Rebecca's been running. Marian picked up her fork again, pushing eggs around her plate without eating them. And even if we could find her, are you sure that's what she needs? What if seeing you makes things worse? What if it opens wounds that have finally started to close? The questions hit him like cold water, forcing him to slow down, to think beyond his immediate emotional response. Was he doing this for Rebecca or for himself? Was he trying to give her closure? Or was he just looking for his own absolution? I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what the right thing is anymore. I spent 5 years being angry at her for leaving without explanation. Now I have the explanation, and I'm angry at myself for not being there to stop her. I'm angry at the universe for taking something we never got to have. I'm angry at time for passing, for putting distance between then and now that can't be crossed. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhausted. I'm just angry, and I don't know where to put it. That's okay, Marian said gently. Anger is allowed. Grief is allowed. You lost something too, Ethan. You lost the future you thought you'd have. You lost 5 years with someone you loved because she was trying to protect you from pain you had every right to share. That's worth being angry about. Her validation felt like permission to feel everything he'd been trying to suppress. The grief for the child he'd never known existed. The rage at circumstances beyond anyone's control. The bone-deep sadness of knowing that Rebecca had been suffering alone while he'd been here, building walls. What do I do now? The question came out small, lost. Marian was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was careful. I think you take time to process this. You've had one night to absorb 5 years' worth of information. That's not enough. Give yourself space to feel what you need to feel. And then, she smiled, sad and knowing. And then you decide if understanding the past is enough, or if you need to try to change the present. They finished breakfast in contemplative silence, the kind that felt companionable rather than uncomfortable. Ethan found himself stealing glances at her, this woman who'd materialized out of nowhere and somehow made space for herself in his life without being intrusive. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, her eyes occasionally drifting to the window where the morning light painted everything gold. I have chores, he said finally, standing to clear their plates. Horses to feed, fence that needs mending. You're welcome to stay, or if you need to get back to Oregon. I took the week off work, Marian interrupted. I wasn't sure how long this would take, or what I'd find when I got here, so unless you want me gone, I'm in no rush. He should have said yes, should have thanked her for the letters and sent her on her way, back to her own life. Should have returned to his solitude and worked through this mess on his own terms. Instead, he heard himself say, You know anything about horses? Her face lit up with a smile that transformed her features. I grew up on a farm in Oregon. I know my way around a stable. Then come on. He grabbed his work gloves from the hook by the door. I could use an extra pair of hands. They worked through the morning side by side, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Marian proved capable with the horses, gentle but firm, exactly the right balance. She mucked stalls without complaint, helped him distribute hay, and even caught his gelding when the stubborn animal decided to play keep-away at feeding time. "He likes you," Ethan observed, watching his horse nuzzle Marion's shoulder. "He doesn't like most people." "Animals know who they can trust," Marion said, stroking the gelding's neck. "They don't lie or hide what they're feeling. It makes them easier to be around sometimes." There was something in her voice, a wistfulness that made Ethan curious. "Is that why you became a teacher? To work with kids who haven't learned to hide yet?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Something like that. I like the honesty of children. They haven't figured out yet that it's safer to keep your pain to yourself." "Like Rebecca did." "Like Rebecca did," she agreed. "Like a lot of people do." He wanted to ask if she was talking about herself. If she had her own pain she kept hidden behind that gentle smile. But before he could formulate the question, she was moving on to the next stall, the next task, keeping herself busy in a way he recognized. He did the same thing, stayed in motion to avoid thinking too hard about things that hurt. By noon, the work was done and they were both sweating despite the cool morning air. Marion had dirt on her cheek and hay in her hair, and she looked more alive than she had sitting perfectly composed in his living room the night before. "You hungry?" Ethan asked, pulling off his gloves. "There's a diner in town. Nothing fancy, but the food's decent." Marion hesitated, and he could see her weighing the offer. Going to town together would mean being seen together, and in a place as small as this, being seen meant becoming the subject of gossip. Did he care? 5 years ago, he would have been conscious of appearances, of what people thought. Now, after last night, after reading those letters and understanding how much time could be wasted on pride and fear, he found he didn't give a damn. "I'd like that," Marion said finally, "but I should clean up first. I'm not fit for public consumption." "You and me both." He gestured toward the house. "Take your time. I'll be ready when you are." The drive into town was quiet, the truck's radio playing low, some classic country station that filled the silence without demanding attention. Ethan drove the familiar roads automatically, his mind elsewhere. Beside him, Marion watched the landscape roll by. Her window cracked just enough to let in the breeze. "It's beautiful here," she said eventually. "I can see why you stayed." "It's isolated," he corrected. "That was the appeal." "Was." She caught the past tense, her eyes flicking to him. "Not anymore?" He thought about it, really considered the question. For 5 years, isolation had been exactly what he wanted, needed even. The solitude had been protective, a buffer between him and a world that had proved it could hurt him. But this morning, working alongside Marion, having another person in his space without feeling crowded, it had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That isolation and peace weren't the same thing. "I don't know," he admitted. "Ask me tomorrow." She smiled at that, and he realized he was starting to like that smile. The way it softened her whole face made her look younger and more hopeful. The diner was exactly what he'd promised. Nothing fancy, but clean and honest. They slid into a booth by the window, and Ethan watched the recognition dawn on the waitress's face when she spotted him. Martha had been serving food here for longer than he'd been alive, and she'd been one of the few people in town who'd bothered to check on him after Rebecca left. "Ethan Cole." Martha approached their table with a pot of coffee and 2 mugs. "Haven't seen you in here for months. Was starting to think you'd forgotten how to socialize." "Just been busy with the ranch, Martha." "Uh-huh." Her eyes slid to Marion with barely concealed curiosity. "And who's your friend?" "Marion Hale." Marion offered her hand across the table. "Just visiting for a few days." "Visiting from where?" "Oregon." Martha's eyebrows rose, but she didn't push. She was nosy, but she also knew where the line was. "Well, welcome to California. You two know what you want, or do you need a minute?" They ordered burgers and fries, and after Martha retreated to the kitchen, Ethan caught Marion's amused expression. "She thinks we're together," Marion said quietly. "Romantically, I mean." "Probably." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "Small town. Not much happens here. Stranger shows up with the hermit, people talk. Does that bother you?" 5 years ago it would have. Now?" He shrugged. "Let them talk. They will anyway." The food came quickly, hot and greasy, and exactly what they both needed. They ate without much conversation, the kind of companionable silence that only comes when people are genuinely comfortable with each other. Ethan was halfway through his burger when he noticed Marion watching someone across the diner, a young couple with a baby and a high chair between them. The mother was trying to coax a spoonful of mashed something into the baby's mouth, while the father laughed at the mess being made. It was such an ordinary scene, the kind of thing you'd see in any restaurant anywhere. But Marion's expression had gone distant, sad in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Marion?" She blinked, coming back to herself. "Sorry, I was just thinking about Rebecca," he guessed. "About the baby?" "Actually, no." She set down her burger, wiping her hands on a napkin. "I was thinking about myself." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan waited, sensing that she needed the space to continue at her own pace. "I was married once," Marion said finally, her voice low. "For about 6 months. We met in college, got married too young, realized too late that we wanted completely different things. He wanted kids right away, a whole house full of them. And I—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I couldn't have them." Ethan felt something shift in his understanding of her. "Couldn't?" "Medical issue. Found out when I was 23. The doctor said it wasn't impossible, but the chances were so slim it wasn't worth hoping for." Her smile was bitter. "My husband left within the year. Said he loved me, but he'd always dreamed of being a father, and he couldn't give up that dream." "Jesus, Marion. I'm sorry." "Don't be." She picked up her water glass, took a long drink. "It was years ago. I've made peace with it, built a life that doesn't include children. I love teaching. I love my students. That's enough." But the way she said it, the way her eyes kept drifting back to that family across the diner, told Ethan it wasn't quite enough. Not completely. "Is that why you came here?" he asked gently. "Because you understood what Rebecca lost?" "Partly." Marion turned back to face him fully. "I know what it's like to grieve for something you never had, to feel like your body betrayed you, like you failed at something fundamental. When I read Rebecca's letters, I recognized that pain, and I thought maybe if someone had told me early on that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't broken, maybe I wouldn't have wasted so much time hating myself." The vulnerability in her confession struck him hard. All this time, he'd been thinking of her as Rebecca's messenger, as a means to an end. He hadn't considered that she might have her own reasons for being here, her own wounds that needed healing. "You're not broken," he said, and meant it. "Your ex-husband was an idiot for leaving." She laughed, surprising them both. "Thank you for that. Though I have to say, in retrospect, I dodged a bullet. Any man who'd abandon someone over something they can't control isn't someone worth keeping." "The same could be said about Rebecca," Ethan pointed out. "She left because she thought her pain made her unworthy of being loved. But that was never true." "No," Marion agreed softly. "It wasn't." They finished their meal, and Ethan paid despite Marion's protests. When they stepped back out into the afternoon sun, he found himself not quite ready to return to the ranch, not ready for the silence that would force him back into his own head. "There's a trail," he heard himself say. "About 10 miles from here. Leads up to a ridge where you can see for miles. If you're not tired of my company yet, I could show you." Marion's smile was answer enough. The trail was exactly as he remembered, steep in places, shaded by towering pines, the air sharp with the scent of sap and earth. They climbed in single file, saving their breath for the ascent, and Ethan found himself watching Marion navigate the path with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. She didn't complain about the difficulty, didn't ask how much farther, just kept moving, steady and sure. At the top, the view opened up like a revelation. Miles of rolling hills, patches of forest, and in the distance, the glint of what might have been a river catching the sun. Marion stood at the edge of the ridge, her hair whipping in the wind, and breathed it all in. "This is incredible," she said, wonder in her voice. "Do you come here often?" "Used to." Ethan settled onto a flat rock, letting his legs dangle over the edge. "Haven't been up here in a couple years, actually." She joined him on the rock, sitting close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Why not?" "Because Rebecca and I used to come here together." He stared out at the landscape, remembering. It was our place. After she left, I couldn't stand to visit it alone. And yet here we are. Here we are, he echoed, and somehow it didn't hurt the way he'd thought it would. Marion's presence didn't erase the memories of Rebecca, but it didn't dishonor them either. They simply existed side by side, past and present, grief and possibility. Can I ask you something? Marion's voice was hesitant. And you can tell me if it's none of my business. Ask. Do you still love her, Rebecca? The question should have been difficult, but the answer came easily. I'll always love who she was, who we were together. But that person, that version of us, it's gone. We can't go back to it even if we wanted to. He turned to look at Marion, found her watching him with those dark eyes that were so like Rebecca's and yet completely her own. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I think that's the healthiest thing I've heard anyone say about a lost relationship in a long time. They sat in silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Ethan found himself acutely aware of Marion beside him, the warmth of her body, the soft sound of her breathing, the way she seemed comfortable with quiet. What about you? He asked eventually. After your marriage ended, was there anyone else? A few attempts. She rested her chin on her knees. Nothing that stuck. Turns out when you open with "I can't have kids," it tends to limit the dating pool, even the men who say it doesn't matter. Eventually, it does. That's their loss. Maybe. She tilted her head to look at him. Or maybe it's just life. Not everyone gets the fairy tale. Some of us get different stories. Different doesn't mean worse. No, she agreed, but it does mean learning to want what you have instead of mourning what you don't. The wisdom in her words spoke of hard-won experience. Ethan understood that kind of learning, the slow, painful process of rebuilding expectations, of finding peace with reality instead of fantasy. I'm glad you came, he said abruptly. I didn't think I would be. Last night when you showed up, I wanted nothing more than for you to leave. But now... He trailed off, not quite sure how to finish. Now? Marion prompted gently. Now I think maybe I needed this. Needed to know the truth, even if it hurt. Needed to stop being angry at shadows. He picked up a small stone and tossed it off the ridge, watching it disappear into the canyon below. And I think maybe I needed to remember what it's like to have someone to talk to. Isolation can be healing, Marion said, but it can also become a trap. I've seen it happen to people. They retreat so far into themselves that they forget how to come back out. Is that what you think I was doing? I think you were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. Her hand found his on the rock between them, her fingers curling around his palm. And there's no shame in that. But I also think you're ready for something different now. The touch should have felt presumptuous, too intimate for how little time they'd known each other. Instead, it felt natural, grounding, like an anchor in a storm he hadn't realized he was still weathering. What if I don't know how? The admission cost him, but he gave it anyway. What if I've been alone so long I've forgotten how to be with people? Then you learn again. Marion squeezed his hand. The same way you learned the first time. Slowly. With patience. With someone who doesn't mind the stumbling. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Understanding, connection, the recognition of two people who'd both been wounded and were trying to figure out how to heal. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, felt awareness prickling along his skin. This was dangerous territory. Marion was Rebecca's sister, however distant their relationship. Getting involved with her would be complicated at best, destructive at worst. It would invite judgment and gossip, and all the messy entanglements he'd spent 5 years avoiding. But God help him, he wanted to. The sun was setting by the time they made their way back down the trail, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. They drove home in silence again, but this time the quiet felt charged with possibility, with questions neither of them was quite ready to ask. Back at the ranch, Marion excused herself to shower while Ethan checked on the animals one final time. The evening chores gave him time to think, to process everything that had happened in the span of less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd been alone, settled in his solitude. Now his house held another person. His heart held new grief and new hope all tangled together, and his future felt suddenly terrifyingly open. He found Marion in the kitchen when he came back inside, her hair wet and loose around her shoulders, wearing fresh clothes she must have retrieved from her truck. She was making tea, moving around his kitchen like she belonged there. "I hope you don't mind," she said, holding up the kettle. "I found these in your cupboard and couldn't resist." "Help yourself to anything." He leaned against the door frame, watching her. "You planning to stay tomorrow too?" She turned to face him fully, tea forgotten. "Do you want me to?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. If she left tomorrow, this could remain simple. A delivery of letters, a brief connection, then back to their separate lives. If she stayed, "Yes," Ethan said, the word coming out rough but certain. "I want you to stay." Something shifted in Marion's expression. Relief, joy, and underneath it all, fear. The same fear he felt. The sense of standing on the edge of something that could either save them or destroy them both. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Marion stayed, and with her presence, the ranch transformed from a place of exile into something that almost resembled a home. She rose early, helping with morning chores before Ethan could protest. She cooked meals that actually had flavor, filled the kitchen with smells he'd forgotten: garlic sautéing, bread baking, coffee brewing strong and rich. She talked to him about small things and large things, about her students in Oregon and his cattle, about books they'd both read and movies they'd both loved. And slowly, carefully, they talked about the things that hurt. 3 days after she'd arrived, they were mending fence in the north pasture when Marion asked the question Ethan had been waiting for. "Have you thought any more about trying to find Rebecca?" He drove another staple into the post before answering, giving himself time to formulate the truth. "I think about it constantly. Every time I remember something from the letters, every time I think about what she went through alone. Part of me wants to track her down, make her listen, tell her she was wrong to carry it all by herself. And the other part?" Ethan straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The sun was merciless today, beating down with an intensity that made everything shimmer. "The other part thinks maybe she left because she needed to. That finding her now would be selfish, more about my need for resolution than her need for peace." Marion was quiet for a moment, holding the wire taut while he secured it. "I don't think either impulse is wrong. They're just different sides of the same grief. Which one do I listen to? Whichever one you can live with." She met his eyes across the fence post. "Because that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Not what's right or wrong in some cosmic sense, but what you can live with, what lets you sleep at night." He'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. All these years, he'd been trying to figure out the morally correct response to Rebecca's abandonment. Should he forgive? Should he stay angry? Should he move on or hold on? But maybe those weren't the right questions. Maybe the only question that mattered was what would allow him to keep breathing, keep living, keep finding reasons to get up in the morning. "I think I can live with letting her go," he said slowly, testing the words. "I think I can live with understanding what happened and accepting that we both made choices. Her to leave, me to stay. We don't get to go back and unmake those choices. We only get to decide what we do next." Marion's smile was soft, approving. "That sounds like wisdom." "It sounds like exhaustion," he corrected, but there was no bitterness in it. "I'm tired of being angry, tired of carrying questions I'll never get perfect answers to. I just want to—" He trailed off, realizing he wasn't sure how to finish. "To what?" Marion prompted gently. "To feel something other than numb," he admitted. "For 5 years I've been going through the motions, working the ranch, paying the bills, existing, but I haven't been living. Haven't let myself want anything or feel anything too deeply because it was safer that way. And now? He looked at her standing there in his borrowed work gloves, hay in her hair and dirt on her jeans, more beautiful than she had any right to be. Now everything felt different. Now the numbness was cracking, and underneath it was a rush of feeling so intense it terrified him. "Now I'm starting to remember what it's like to want things," he said quietly. The air between them seemed to thicken. Marion's eyes widened slightly, understanding flickering across her features. She opened her mouth as if to speak, But whatever she might have said was interrupted by the distant rumble of thunder. They both looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, moving fast. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last few minutes, and the wind was picking up, carrying the metallic smell of approaching rain. "We should get back to the house," Ethan said, gathering their tools. "This is going to be bad." They made it halfway across the pasture before the first drops fell, fat and heavy, the kind that promised a deluge. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked through, laughing breathlessly as they stumbled inside and slammed the door against the wind. The storm hit with fury. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged forks. Thunder shook the house, rattling dishes in the cupboards. Ethan moved through the room's closing windows while Marion grabbed towels from the bathroom. "I should check the horses," he said, peeling off his sodden shirt and reaching for the rain slicker hanging by the door. "In this?" Marion looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Ethan, you can't even see 10 feet in front of you. They get spooked in storms. If they panic and hurt themselves, then we'll deal with it when the storm passes." She put herself between him and the door, her hand on his bare chest. The touch sent electricity through him that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "You going out there isn't going to help them. It's just going to get you killed." He wanted to argue, but she was right. The storm was biblical in its intensity, the kind that turned dirt roads into rivers and made even short distances treacherous. He could hear things hitting the house, branches, debris, maybe part of someone's roof. Going out in this would be suicide. "Fine," he relented, stepping back. "But if anything happens to them, we'll handle it together." Marion's hand was still on his chest, her palm warm against his skin. She seemed to realize it suddenly, her eyes dropping to where they were connected. She pulled back quickly, color rising in her cheeks. You should change. Get into dry clothes." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and retreated to his bedroom. The wet jeans came off with difficulty, clinging to his legs. He toweled off roughly and pulled on sweatpants and a dry t-shirt, trying to ignore the way his heart was racing, trying to ignore the memory of Marion's hand on his skin, the way her breath had caught when she'd touched him. This was dangerous. This was Rebecca's sister. This was everything he'd told himself he wouldn't do. But when he came back out to the living room and found Marion standing by the window watching the storm, her own clothes changed into something dry, her hair loose and slightly damp around her shoulders. All his resolutions felt flimsy, unconvincing. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely. The house plunged into darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. "Flashlights are in the kitchen," Ethan said, moving carefully through the familiar space. "And I've got candles somewhere. Used to keep them for emergencies." He found the candles in a drawer, along with matches that were mercifully dry. Within minutes, he'd lit several and placed them around the living room, creating pools of warm light that pushed back the darkness. The effect was intimate, almost romantic, and he tried not to think about how aware he was of every movement Marion made. She'd settled onto the couch, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. The storm continued its assault outside, but here in the candlelight there was a sense of safety, of being sheltered from chaos. "I love storms," Marion said suddenly. "Always have. There's something cleansing about them, like the world is washing itself clean." Ethan sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining distance even though part of him wanted to close it. "My mother used to hate them. She'd go around the house unplugging everything, convinced we'd be struck by lightning." "Was she right? Did you ever get struck?" "Once. Hit a tree about 50 yards from the house, split it right down the middle." He smiled at the memory. "My mother said it was a sign we should move to the city. My father said it was a sign the tree was rotten and needed to come down anyway. They argued about it for weeks." "Who won?" "Neither. The tree came down, we stayed on the ranch, and my mother kept unplugging things during storms until the day she died." The words came easier than they usually did when he talked about his parents. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was Marion's presence making it safe to remember. They fought about everything, those two, but they loved each other fiercely. I used to think that's what marriage was, finding someone worth fighting with. And with Rebecca. He considered the question carefully. We didn't fight. We should have. All that silence, all those things left unsaid. Maybe if we'd fought more, talked more, pushed each other harder, things would have been different. Or maybe you'd have just hurt each other faster. Marion pulled the blanket tighter. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes it's avoidance. The trick is knowing which is which. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face in stark relief. In that moment, she looked achingly vulnerable, and Ethan found himself wondering what silences she'd kept, what pain she'd protected or avoided. "What about you?" he asked. "When your marriage ended, did you fight, or did you go quiet?" "Oh, we fought." Her laugh was hollow. "He wanted to try fertility treatments, wanted to spend money we didn't have on procedures that had a 5% success rate. I wanted to accept reality and move on. We fought about it for months until there was nothing left between us but resentment and broken dreams." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me something important." She looked at him across the candlelight. "It taught me that you can't build a future on what you don't have. You have to build it on what you do have. And if what you have isn't enough for the other person, then they're not your person." The words settled into the space between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan thought about Rebecca, about the future they'd lost before it began, about the 5 years he'd spent mourning what wasn't instead of seeing what was. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "When I stopped being so angry." Marion shifted on the couch, tucking her feet under her. "Anger is exhausting. It takes so much energy to maintain, and at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything. The thing you're angry about still happened. You're just tired and bitter on top of it." He knew exactly what she meant. The anger he'd carried toward Rebecca had been a weight that pressed down on everything, coloring every interaction, every decision. Letting it go, truly letting it go, felt like setting down a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was getting worse, the wind howling like something alive and furious. Another crack of thunder shook the house, and Marion flinched despite herself. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "Fine, just loud." But her hands were gripping the blanket tightly, knuckles white. He stood, moving to the couch before he could think better of it. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat beside her, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth of her body through the blanket. Close enough that when the next thunderclap came, she leaned into him instinctively, seeking comfort. The touch was electric. Ethan felt it in every nerve, every cell. His arm went around her shoulders without conscious thought, and she melted into him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder like it belonged there. "This is a bad idea," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. "Terrible," he agreed, his voice rough. "Probably the worst idea either of us has had in years. People will talk, they'll judge, they'll say it's wrong." "They will. Rebecca, if she ever finds out, would have no right to be angry," Ethan finished. "She left. She made her choice. We don't owe her our loneliness." Marion tilted her head to look up at him, and in the candlelight, her eyes were luminous. "Is that what this is? Just two lonely people seeking comfort?" Was it? Ethan searched his feelings, trying to separate what was real from what was convenient, trying to distinguish between genuine connection and the simple human need for touch after years of isolation. "No," he said finally, honestly. "It's more than that, at least for me." "For me too," she breathed. "And that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I didn't come here looking for this. I came to deliver letters, to give you closure, to maybe ease some of my own guilt about not being there for Rebecca when she needed me. I didn't come here to—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "To fall for someone?" The words felt presumptuous, but he said them anyway. Needed to say them. "To feel this much this fast," she corrected softly. "I've known you for days, Ethan. Days. This doesn't make sense." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." But sense had nothing to do with the way his heart raced when she smiled. Had nothing to do with how right it felt to have her in his house, in his space, in his life. Had nothing to do with the fact that he'd woken up this morning thinking about her before his eyes were fully open, or that the thought of her leaving made his chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to panic. The storm raged outside, and inside their breathing seemed too loud in the quiet. Ethan was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, her shoulder against his chest, her hip pressed to his thigh, the way her hand had come to rest on his knee, fingers curled lightly around the fabric of his sweatpants. "We should talk about this," Marion said, even as she shifted closer. "We should be rational and careful and think about all the reasons this is complicated." "We should," Ethan agreed, his hand coming up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. "We should definitely not kiss," she continued, but her eyes had dropped to his mouth. "Definitely not. Because that would make everything more complicated. So much more complicated." She turned in his arms, and suddenly they were face to face, mere inches separating them. Ethan could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could count her eyelashes if he wanted to, could feel the warmth of her breath against his lips. "Ethan," she whispered, and his name on her lips was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Later, neither of them would be able to say who moved first. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way their mouths met, tentative at first, testing. What mattered was the soft sound she made in the back of her throat when he deepened the kiss. What mattered was the way her hands came up to frame his face, holding him like something precious. The kiss was slow, exploratory. Nothing rushed about it. They had time, all the time in the world, here in this moment while the storm raged and the candles flickered and the rest of the world ceased to exist. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "We just made everything incredibly complicated," Marion said, but she was smiling. "Worth it," he replied, and kissed her again. This time was different, deeper, more urgent. 5 years of loneliness and longing poured into that kiss, and Marion met him with equal fervor. Her fingers tangled in his hair, and he pulled her closer, needing to feel her against him, needing to know this was real. When they broke apart again, Marion was trembling. "We should stop." "Do you want to stop?" "No." The word was barely audible. "But I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of this being a mistake, of us hurting each other, of Rebecca finding out and feeling betrayed." She pulled back slightly, putting necessary distance between them. "Of this being grief and loneliness pretending to be something more." Ethan understood the fear. He felt it too. The worry that what they were feeling was just a reaction to pain, a way to fill the void that loss had carved in both of them. But when he looked at Marion, when he remembered the past few days of conversation and laughter and quiet understanding, he couldn't believe it was that simple. "What if it's not pretending?" he asked. "What if this is real, and we're just too scared to trust it?" "How do we know the difference?" "We don't. Not right now. Not this soon." He took her hand, threading their fingers together. "But maybe we don't have to know. Maybe we just have to be willing to find out." Marion stared at their joined hands, and he could see the war playing out across her features, fear and hope, caution and desire, all battling for dominance. "I'm leaving in 3 days," she said finally. "I have to get back to Oregon. Back to my job, my life. What happens then?" The question was practical, grounding, and Ethan appreciated her for asking it, for not letting them get swept away in the moment without considering the consequences. "I don't know," he admitted. "We figure it out, or we don't. But Marion," he waited until she met his eyes. "I'd rather have 3 days of something real with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been." She was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening to a steady drumming against the roof. "Okay," she said finally, and the word felt like a leap off a cliff. "Okay. We have 3 days. Let's not waste them being afraid." Ethan pulled her back into his arms, and she came willingly, settling against his chest with a sigh that sounded like relief. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the blanket, listening to the storm fade. No more kisses. Not yet. Just holding each other, being present, allowing themselves this moment of peace. "Tell me something," Marion said eventually, "something you've never told anyone else." He thought about it, sifting through memories and secrets until he found one that felt right. "When Rebecca left, the first thing I did after reading her note was go to the hardware store and buy new locks for all the doors. I told myself it was practical. She'd taken her keys, and I didn't want her coming back when I wasn't home. But the truth was, I was installing them to keep myself from going after her. Every time I wanted to drive to wherever she'd gone and demand answers, I'd look at those new locks and remember that I'd chosen to shut that door. Marion's arms tightened around him. That's heartbreaking. It was survival. If I'd gone after her, if I'd fought for someone who clearly didn't want to be fought for, it would have destroyed me. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. Your turn. Tell me something. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. After my husband left, I threw away everything he'd ever given me. Gifts, photos, cards. All of it went in the trash. Everything except one thing. A bookmark he'd bought me on our honeymoon. It was cheap, just a laminated piece of cardboard with a picture of the beach where we stayed. But I kept it. I still use it. And every time I see it, I feel guilty for not being able to hate him completely. Why would you hate him? Because he left me when I needed him most. Because he chose the idea of children he didn't have over the reality of the woman he did have. Because he made me feel broken and insufficient. She drew in a shaky breath. But I can't hate him. Because part of me understands. He wanted something I couldn't give him. That's not villainous. It's just sad. Ethan tilted her chin up so he could see her face. You're not broken. And you're not insufficient. You're the furthest thing from it. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you drove halfway across the country to give a stranger the truth because you thought he deserved it. I know you stayed to help even though you had every reason to leave. I know you work with children because you love them even though you can't have your own. I know you're brave and kind and thoughtful, and anyone who couldn't see that doesn't deserve you. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. You can't say things like that to me. You can't make me feel things I haven't let myself feel in years. Why not? Because it's dangerous. Because caring about people means they can hurt you. Because I've worked very hard to build a life where I'm safe from that kind of pain. And look where it's gotten us both. Ethan wiped her tears away with his thumbs, gentle and careful. We've been safe and alone and numb. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to be brave enough to risk getting hurt again. What if I'm not that brave? You are. You proved it by coming here in the first place. She kissed him then, soft and sweet and tasting of salt from her tears. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude and fear and the fragile beginning of hope. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. 3 days, she said. We have 3 days to figure out if this is real. 3 days, he agreed. They stayed on the couch as the storm finally passed, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Marion told him about her classroom in Oregon, about the student who'd written her a poem about butterflies, about the way teaching filled a space in her heart that might have held children of her own. Ethan told her about the ranch, about plans he had to expand the herd, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. They talked until the candles burned low and exhaustion made their words slur. At some point, Marion fell asleep against his shoulder, her breathing deep and even. Ethan stayed awake a while longer, marveling at the trust implied in her unconsciousness. She felt safe with him, safe enough to let go, to be vulnerable, to rest. He thought about the past 5 years, about the walls he'd built and the isolation he'd chosen. He thought about Rebecca and the baby they'd lost and all the grief that had seemed insurmountable. And he thought about how strange it was that healing could come from such an unexpected source, from the sister of the woman who'd broken his heart, from 3 days of borrowed time, from the courage to risk feeling something again. Eventually, he dozed off too. And when he woke in the gray light of pre-dawn, Marion was still in his arms. She stirred when he moved, blinking up at him sleepily. Morning, she murmured. Morning. He brushed hair back from her face. How'd you sleep? Better than I have in months. She stretched, cat-like, then seemed to remember where she was. A blush crept up her cheeks. We fell asleep on the couch. We did. That's very domestic of us. Terrifyingly domestic, he agreed, and they both laughed. The moment felt perfect, natural and easy and right in a way that made all of Marion's fears seem distant. But Ethan could see them creeping back in as she fully woke up, as reality reasserted itself. I should make coffee, she said, starting to pull away. Marion, he caught her hand. Don't. Don't what? Don't retreat. Don't start building walls because you're scared. Stay here with me, just for a minute. She settled back against him, and he felt her body relax. I'm not good at this, she admitted. Letting people in, trusting that they'll stay. Neither am I. We can be terrible at it together. That earned him a smile. Is that what we're doing, being terrible at things together? Among other things. He kissed her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. We're also being brave and honest and willing to see where this goes, even though I'm leaving in 3 days. Even though. She turned in his arms, facing him fully. What if 3 days isn't enough? What if it just makes saying goodbye harder? Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But Marion, I'd rather have 3 perfect days with you than a lifetime of wondering what we missed. She searched his face, looking for something, certainty maybe, or a promise he couldn't make. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. 3 days. Let's make them count. They made coffee together in the early morning light, moving around the kitchen with a familiarity that shouldn't have been possible after such a short time. Marion found the mugs without asking where they were kept. Ethan knew without being told that she took her coffee with cream, but no sugar. These small synchronicities felt like gifts, evidence that what was happening between them wasn't just convenient or reactionary, but something deeper. The storm had left the world washed clean. Through the kitchen window, everything gleamed with moisture, the grass impossibly green, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. A few branches littered the yard, and one section of fence had come down, but overall the damage was minimal. The horses were fine, clustered together in the far corner of the pasture, calm now that the chaos had passed. 2 days left, Marion said quietly, cradling her mug between both hands. She stood at the window, backlit by morning sun, and Ethan felt his chest tighten at the sight of her. 2 days, he confirmed, coming to stand beside her. What do you want to do with them? She turned to look at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression. I want to pretend the world doesn't exist. I want to stay here in this bubble where it's just us and nothing complicated can touch us. That sounds perfect, he said, but you know we can't actually do that. I know. She sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. The world has a way of intruding whether we want it to or not. As if to prove her point, Ethan's phone rang from where he'd left it charging on the counter. He considered ignoring it, but the ranch didn't run itself, and there were always things that needed attention. He crossed to answer it, and Marion watched him with understanding in her eyes. The call was from Tom Henderson, who owned the neighboring property. A section of his fence had come down in the storm, and some of his cattle had wandered onto Ethan's land. Could Ethan help round them up? It would take most of the morning, maybe into the afternoon if the animals had scattered far. Go, Marion said when he hung up. I'll be here when you get back. Come with me, he said impulsively. It's nothing glamorous, just riding and roping, but we'd be together. Her smile was radiant. Give me 5 minutes to change. They saddled 2 horses and rode out together into the morning. The air was crisp and clean, still cool from the storm. Marion sat her horse like she'd been born to it, comfortable and confident in the saddle. They found Tom's cattle grazing peacefully near the creek, and between the 3 of them, Ethan, Marion, and Tom, they had the animals rounded up and headed back toward the broken fence within a couple of hours. Appreciate the help, Tom said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and solid, who'd ranched this land his entire life. His eyes kept drifting to Marion with poorly concealed curiosity. Don't believe I've met your friend, Ethan. Marion Hale, she offered, extending her hand. Just visiting for a few days. Visiting from where? Oregon. Tom's eyebrows rose. That's quite a distance for a visit. Tom, Ethan said with a warning edge to his voice. Don't. Don't what? I'm just being friendly, making conversation. But there was a knowing glint in the older man's eyes. You ought to bring her to the gathering tomorrow night, Ethan. Introduce her around properly. What gathering? Marion asked. Monthly thing, Tom explained. All the ranchers and their families get together at the community center. Potluck dinner, bit of music, chance to catch up with neighbors. Nothing fancy, but it's nice. Helps folks remember they're part of something bigger than their own land. Ethan had been avoiding these gatherings for years. After Rebecca left, the questions and sympathetic looks had been unbearable. Eventually, people stopped asking, stopped looking, and he'd become a fixture in his absence. The hermit on the hill, the man who preferred solitude to company. I don't think, he started. We'd love to come, Marian interrupted, looking at him with challenge in her eyes. What time should we be there? Tom grinned. 6 o'clock. And Marian, bring whatever you're comfortable making. Everyone contributes something. After Tom left, Ethan and Marian rode back toward his ranch in silence. He could feel her waiting for him to say something, to explain why he'd tried to refuse the invitation. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. I know, but I wanted to. She guided her horse closer to his. You said you wanted to stop being alone, stop just existing. Well, that means actually being part of the world again, and I'd like to be there with you when you take that step. People will talk, they'll assume things. Let them. There was steel in her voice. Ethan, we have 2 days. I don't want to spend them hiding, I want to spend them living. If that means facing gossip and judgment, so be it. He studied her face, seeing the determination there. She was braver than he was, had been from the start. While he'd spent 5 years retreating, she'd spent them building a life, helping children, finding purpose even in the midst of her own pain. She knew how to show up for the world even when it hurt. Okay, he said. We'll go. But I'm warning you now, it's going to be awkward as hell. Most worthwhile things are. She smiled. Besides, I'm a teacher. I deal with awkward on a daily basis. I can handle a few nosy ranchers. They spent the rest of the day working on the ranch, repairing the storm damage, checking on the herd. They worked side by side, and Ethan found himself constantly aware of her presence, the sound of her voice when she talked to the horses, the efficiency of her movements, the way she laughed when he told her stories about the more stubborn animals. In the late afternoon, they took a break, sitting together on the porch with cold drinks and the satisfaction of hard work done well. The sun was beginning its descent, painting everything in shades of gold. This is nice, Marian said, her head resting on his shoulder. I could get used to this. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Because getting used to this would mean more than 2 days, would mean figuring out how to bridge the distance between Oregon and California, would mean deciding if what they felt was strong enough to build something lasting on. Marian, Ethan said carefully, what happens after you leave? She was quiet for a long moment. I've been trying not to think about it. We should probably think about it, make some kind of plan. I'm not sure I'm ready for plans. She sat up, turning to face him. Plans require certainty, and I'm not certain about anything except that being here with you feels right in a way nothing has felt right in a very long time. That's something. Is it enough? The question was plaintive, searching. Is feeling right enough to uproot lives, to ask each other for sacrifices, to risk everything on something that's only existed for a handful of days? Ethan didn't have an answer. Part of him wanted to say yes, to damn the consequences and hold on to this feeling with both hands. But the practical part of him, the part that had learned to be cautious with his heart, held him back. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I don't want this to end when you drive away. I know that much. Neither do I. She took his hand, threading their fingers together. So we'll figure it out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we'll figure it out. That night, they made dinner together, pasta with vegetables from the garden, garlic bread, a simple salad. They ate at the kitchen table with candles lit between them, not because the power was out, but because they wanted the intimacy of soft light. They talked about small things and large things, about the gathering tomorrow and what they'd bring, about Marian's students and Ethan's plans for the ranch. And when the meal was done and the dishes were washed, when there was nothing left to do but acknowledge what they both wanted, Marian took Ethan's hand and led him to his bedroom. There was no hesitation in her movements, no second guessing, just certainty and desire and the courage to claim what they both needed. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other with hands and mouths and whispered words. Every touch felt like a discovery, every kiss like a promise. And when they finally came together, It was with a sense of rightness that transcended the physical. This wasn't just two lonely people seeking comfort. This was connection, real and deep and terrifying in its intensity. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, neither speaking, just breathing in sync and holding on. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling, a door opening. For 5 years, he'd kept himself locked away, convinced that safety lay in solitude. But here in Marian's arms, vulnerable and exposed and completely present, he felt safer than he had in his isolation. "I'm falling for you," he whispered into her hair. "I know it's too soon. I know it's crazy. But I am." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "I'm falling for you too. And you're right. It is crazy. But I don't care." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. And when morning came too early, neither wanted to let go. But the day demanded their attention, and there was a gathering to prepare for. Marian spent the morning baking, an apple pie that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and butter. Ethan watched her work, marveling at how completely she'd integrated into his space. There were her shoes by the door, her jacket hanging on the hook, her laughter bouncing off walls that hadn't heard such sound in years. By 5:30, they were both dressed and ready, the pie wrapped carefully for transport. Ethan wore jeans and a button-down shirt, as dressed up as he ever got for these things. Marian had changed into a simple dress, dark green with small flowers, and she looked beautiful in a way that made his breath catch. "Ready?" she asked, and he could hear the nervousness beneath her brave front. "No," he admitted, "but let's go anyway." The community center was already full when they arrived. Trucks and cars filled the parking lot, and through the windows, Ethan could see people milling about, setting up food on long tables, children running between groups of adults. He felt his stomach clench with anxiety. This was his community, people he'd grown up with, worked alongside, avoided for years. Walking in there with Marian would be a statement. It would invite questions and speculation and judgment. "We can leave," Marian said quietly, reading his hesitation. "If this is too much, we can just go back to the ranch." But that would be retreating again, choosing safety over courage. And Ethan was done retreating. "No," he said, taking her hand. "We're here. Let's do this." They walked in together, and the effect was immediate. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, eyes widened with surprise and curiosity. Martha from the diner was there, and her knowing smile said she'd already spread the word about seeing them together. Tom Henderson raised his beer in a silent salute, and then Sarah Reeves approached them, her husband Jack trailing behind. Sarah had been Rebecca's friend once, and the pity in her eyes when she looked at Ethan had always made his skin crawl. "Ethan," she said warmly, "it's been too long. We've missed seeing you at these things." "Been busy with the ranch," he said, the old excuse coming automatically. "Of course." Her eyes slid to Marian with undisguised curiosity. "And who's this?" Before Ethan could answer, Marian stepped forward with her hand extended and a smile that was all warmth. "Marian Hale. I'm visiting from Oregon." "How do you know Ethan?" Sarah asked, and there was something sharp beneath the friendly tone. "Through family," Marian said smoothly, not elaborating. "It's a beautiful community you have here. Ethan's told me so much about everyone." The deflection was masterful, and Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. Sarah looked like she wanted to press for more details, but Jack was already pulling her away toward the food tables, probably sensing the dangerous waters his wife was wading into. They made their way to an empty spot near the back, setting down the pie among the other desserts. More people approached, introducing themselves, welcoming Marian, asking polite questions that were really fishing expeditions. Through it all, Marian remained poised and friendly, giving nothing away while somehow making everyone feel acknowledged. "You're good at this," Ethan murmured when they had a moment alone. "Years of parent-teacher conferences," she said. "You learn to navigate social minefields with a smile." The dinner was served buffet style, and they filled plates with potluck offerings, casseroles and salads, fried chicken and baked beans, rolls and corn on the cob. They found seats at a table with Tom and his wife Margaret, along with another couple Ethan knew from neighboring ranches. The conversation was easy, flowing between ranch talk and local news, the upcoming county fair, and someone's granddaughter's wedding. Marion fit in seamlessly, asking questions and sharing appropriate anecdotes from her own life in Oregon. Ethan found himself relaxing incrementally, the tension draining from his shoulders. And then the music started. Someone had brought a guitar, and another person produced a fiddle, and soon there was impromptu dancing in the cleared space at the center of the room. Couples took to the floor, some young, some old, all moving with the easy familiarity of people who'd danced together for years. "Dance with me," Marion said, standing and extending her hand. Ethan froze. He hadn't danced in years. Hadn't wanted to. The last time had been at a friend's wedding with Rebecca, and she'd complained the whole time that he had no rhythm, that he was stepping on her feet, that they looked ridiculous. But Marion was looking at him with hope in her eyes, and he realized he wanted to try, wanted to make new memories that could overlay the old ones. "I'm not very good," he warned as he took her hand. "Neither am I. We'll be terrible together." They moved onto the floor, and Ethan pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. The music was slow, something mournful and beautiful, and they swayed together more than really danced. Marion fit against him perfectly, her head tucked beneath his chin, and he closed his eyes and just felt her warmth, her trust, the rightness of this moment. Around them, he could feel eyes watching, could practically hear the speculation, the whispers. The hermit dancing with a stranger, Ethan Cole with a woman who wasn't his ex-wife. What did it mean? Where had she come from? How serious was it? He didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let them judge. Because here in his arms was something real and precious, and their opinions couldn't touch it. "Thank you," he murmured into Marion's hair. "For what?" "For making me do this. For not letting me hide anymore." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and her eyes were bright with emotion. "Thank you for being brave enough to try." The song ended, but they stayed on the floor for the next one, and the one after that. Other couples joined them, and gradually the attention shifted away. They were just another pair among many, moving to music that was older than any of them, part of a tradition that connected past to present. When they finally left the dance floor, breathless and laughing, Tom caught Ethan's eye and gave him a subtle nod. Approval, maybe. Or just recognition that Ethan was finally rejoining the living. They stayed for another hour, mingling and talking, and Ethan found himself enjoying it more than he'd expected. These were his people, his community. He'd forgotten that during his years of isolation, had forgotten that belonging to something larger than himself could feel good. On the drive home, Marion was quiet, staring out the window at the dark landscape rolling by. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "More than okay." She turned to look at him, and even in the dim light from the dashboard, he could see her smile. "That was wonderful. Seeing you with your community, watching you open up and let people in, it was everything I'd hoped for. I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have. You just needed a reason to try." She reached over and took his hand. "I'm glad I could be that reason." Back at the ranch, they sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, wrapped in a blanket against the cool night air. Tomorrow was Marion's last full day. The day after, she'd drive back to Oregon, back to her job and her students and the life she'd built there. "I don't want you to go," Ethan said into the quiet. "I don't want to go either." "So stay." The words were out before he could stop them, reckless and desperate. Marion went very still beside him. "Ethan, I know what I'm asking. I know it's not fair that you have responsibilities, a whole life somewhere else. But stay. Or let me come with you, or we'll figure out some way to make this work that doesn't involve saying goodbye." "You'd leave the ranch?" She sounded stunned. "Ethan, this place is everything to you." "It was everything," he corrected, "because it was all I had. But you've reminded me that there are things more important than land and cattle and isolation. You've reminded me what it feels like to want to share my life with someone." Marion was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. "I have a contract with my school. I can't just leave mid-semester. I have students who depend on me." "I know. I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe there's a way to have both, to honor your commitments while also building something with me." "Like what? Long distance until the school year ends? That's months away." What if we can't survive that long apart? What if the distance kills what we have? What if it doesn't? He turned her to face him, cradling her face in his hands. What if we're strong enough to make it work? What if what we have is real enough to weather a few months of phone calls and visits? I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. But I'm more scared of letting you drive away and spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. He kissed her softly, tasting salt from her tears. I love you, Marion. I know it's too soon. I know we're supposed to take our time and be reasonable, but I love you. Not as a replacement for Rebecca, not as a way to fill the void. I love you for exactly who you are. She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You can't just say that. You can't just tell me you love me when I'm supposed to leave tomorrow. Why not? Because it makes everything so much harder. Or so much easier. He wiped her tears away with his thumbs. Because now you know. Now you don't have to wonder if this is real, or if it's just a moment out of time. It's real, Marion. What I feel for you is real. She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, pouring everything she felt into that connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she said. And that terrifies me, because I've built my whole life around not needing anyone, around being complete on my own. And now here you are, making me want things I'd given up on. Then want them. Want me. Want us. He held her close, feeling her heart beating against his chest. We'll figure out the logistics, the distance, the timing, all of it. But first, just say you'll try. Say you won't give up on this before we've even started. Okay, she breathed. Okay, I'll try. We'll try. They went inside and made love with a new urgency, knowing their time was running short. Every touch felt weighted with meaning, every kiss a promise. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, it was with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring decisions and plans and the hard work of building something real. But for tonight, they had each other. And that was enough. Morning came too quickly, washing the bedroom in pale gold light that seemed to mock the weight pressing down on both their hearts. Marion's last full day. Tomorrow, she'd pack her truck and drive away, back to Oregon, back to a life that suddenly felt inadequate compared to what she'd found here. Ethan lay awake watching her sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on her face, the way her hair spread across his pillow, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He tried to imagine this bed without her in it, and felt his chest constrict with something close to panic. She stirred eventually, her eyes opening slowly, focusing on his face. A smile bloomed across her features before reality crashed back in, dimming the joy. Don't, Ethan said softly, touching her cheek. Don't let the sadness in yet. We still have today. Today, she repeated as if testing the word. Just today. Then let's make it count. They rose and dressed in comfortable silence, the kind born of intimacy rather than awkwardness. Over breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, coffee strong and black, they finally had the conversation they'd been avoiding. I've been thinking about the logistics, Marion said, her fingers wrapped around her mug. My contract runs through June. That's 4 months from now. I can't leave my students mid-year, Ethan. It wouldn't be right. I know. I wouldn't ask you to. But after June, she paused, meeting his eyes. After June, I'm free. I could choose not to renew, could look for teaching positions here in California. Hope flared in his chest, bright and fierce. You'd do that? Leave Oregon? What's keeping me there besides a job I could do anywhere? She set down her mug, leaning forward. My parents are gone. I have friends, but no one so close that distance would destroy the relationship. The school is good, but it's not the only good school. And you? Her voice softened. You're here. This is where you've built your life, your livelihood. The ranch isn't something you can pack up and move. But teaching? I can teach anywhere there are children who need it. Ethan felt emotion swell in his throat, making it hard to speak. That's a huge sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice if I'm choosing it freely. If I'm choosing you, us, the life we could build together. She reached across the table, taking his hand. But Ethan, I need you to be sure. 4 months is a long time to wait. long enough for doubts to creep in, for reality to tarnish what we've had here. I need to know you'll still want this, want me, when the newness wears off. I will, he said with absolute certainty. This isn't infatuation or rebound or filling a void. This is real. You're real. What we have is real. Then we need a plan, a real one, with specifics and commitments. They spent the morning mapping out the next 4 months. Phone calls every evening, video chats on weekends, visits when they could manage them. Marion could drive down during spring break. Ethan could hire temporary help for the ranch and visit her in Oregon. They'd be honest about the hard parts, communicate through the rough patches, and trust that what they felt was strong enough to survive the distance. And in June, Marion said, I'll come back. For good. We'll figure out the rest. Where exactly I'll teach, whether we'll need to expand the house, all of it. But I'll come back to you. Promise? The word came out smaller than he intended, vulnerable. I promise. She stood and moved around the table, settling into his lap and wrapping her arms around his neck. I promise, Ethan Cole. You're not getting rid of me that easily. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, trying to pour 4 months' worth of longing into that single connection. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, in case I didn't mention it enough last night. You mentioned it. Her smile was radiant, but I don't mind hearing it again. They spent the afternoon doing deliberately normal things, repairing the fence damaged by the storm, grooming the horses, taking a long ride through the hills. Every mundane activity felt precious, moments they were banking against the loneliness that would come. They took pictures on Marion's phone, silly selfies and candid shots, building a catalog of memories to sustain them through the separation. As evening approached, they drove into town one last time. Ethan had an errand he needed to run, something he'd been thinking about since last night. He parked in front of the small jewelry store on Main Street, and Marion looked at him with questions in her eyes. Come with me, he said. Inside, the store was quiet, smelling of polish and old wood. Mrs. Chen, who'd owned the place for 40 years, greeted them with a knowing smile. Ethan Cole, she said warmly. I heard you'd come back to the land of the living, and this must be the young lady who accomplished that miracle. Marion Hale, Marion introduced herself, clearly puzzled about why they were there. We'd like to look at rings, Ethan said, and watched Marion's eyes go wide. Ethan, what? Not engagement rings, he clarified quickly, seeing the panic flash across her face. Not yet. We're not ready for that. But something else. Something that means we're committed to making this work. That means we belong to each other even when we're apart. Understanding dawned in Marion's expression, followed by something that looked like relief mixed with joy. Promise rings. If that's not too high school for you, she laughed, the sound bright and genuine. I think it's perfect. Mrs. Chen led them to a display case, and they spent the next hour looking at options. Nothing too flashy or expensive, these were symbols, not status statements. They finally settled on a pair of simple silver bands, each engraved on the inside with a date. Not today's date, but the date Marion had first arrived at the ranch, the day their lives had intersected and changed course. We'll have them ready tomorrow morning, Mrs. Chen said, taking measurements. You can pick them up before you head out, dear. Back at the ranch, they cooked dinner together one last time, steaks on the grill, roasted vegetables, a salad from the garden. They ate outside on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. The air was warm for February, touched with the promise of spring to come. Tell me about your students, Ethan said as they cleared the dishes. I want to be able to picture where you are, what you're doing, when we're talking on the phone. So Marion told him about her third-grade classroom, about the boy who struggled with reading but excelled at math, about the girl whose parents were going through a divorce and needed extra patience, about the twins who finished each other's sentences and could never sit still. She painted pictures with her words, and Ethan found himself falling in love with her all over again, seeing the passion she brought to her work, the care she invested in children who weren't her own, but might as well have been. They're lucky to have you, he said when she finished. I'm lucky to have them. They remind me every day that love comes in all forms, that you don't have to give birth to someone to shape their life, to matter to them. She looked at him with eyes that held old pain alongside new hope. For a long time, I thought not being able to have children meant I couldn't be a mother. But those kids? They've taught me that motherhood is about showing up, being present, caring enough to invest in their futures. Biology is just one way of making a family. And there are other ways, Ethan said softly. Yes, there are. They cleaned up together, moving through the familiar routine, neither wanting to acknowledge that this was the last time for months. When the kitchen was spotless and there were no more tasks to occupy their hands, they retreated to the living room. Rebecca's letters still sat on the side table, tied with their blue ribbon. Ethan had read them all multiple times now, had absorbed their truth and made his peace with it. But there was one thing left undone. I need to write to her, he said, picking up the bundle. To Rebecca. Not to send necessarily, but to close the loop, I guess. To say the things I would have said if she'd given me the chance. Do you want me to leave you alone? Marian asked. No, stay. You're part of this now. He found paper and a pen, and for the first time in 5 years, he wrote to his ex-wife. The words came slowly at first, then faster, spilling out with a force he hadn't anticipated. He wrote about his anger and his grief, about the years of not understanding, about the baby he'd never known existed, and the future they'd lost. He wrote about forgiveness, for her, for himself, for the universe that had dealt them such a cruel hand. And then he wrote about Marian, about finding unexpected love in the least likely place, about learning that healing could come from the most surprising sources, about being given a second chance at happiness and being brave enough to take it. He wrote for an hour, maybe more, while Marian sat quietly beside him, her presence a comfort and an anchor. When he finally set down the pen, his hand was cramping but his heart felt lighter. What will you do with it? Marian asked. Ethan looked at the pages covered in his handwriting, all the things he'd needed to say finally given form. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe just writing it was enough. Or maybe, Marian said carefully, you could send it. Not to hurt her or make demands, but just to let her know you understand now. That you've found peace. That she doesn't have to carry the guilt anymore. The idea had merit. Rebecca had written him dozens of unsent letters, words she'd needed to say but couldn't. Maybe giving her this, proof that he'd survived, that he'd forgiven her, that he'd moved on, would grant her the same freedom. I'll think about it, he said, folding the letter and setting it aside. Right now, I just want to focus on you, on us, on making the most of tonight. They made love with desperate tenderness, as if trying to imprint every sensation on their memories. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, neither sleeping, both holding on. 4 months, Marian whispered. We can do this, right? We can do this, Ethan confirmed. It'll be hard, but we're both stronger than we give ourselves credit for. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't retreat, that you'll stay connected to your community, keep going to the gatherings, maintain the progress you've made. I don't want you sliding back into isolation just because I'm not here. I promise. And you promise me you'll take care of yourself. That you won't work yourself to exhaustion trying to distract from missing me. Deal. She kissed his chest, right over his heart. We're going to make this work, Ethan. I can feel it. So can I. They finally fell asleep near dawn, exhausted and emotionally spent. When they woke a few hours later, the sun was already high. Marian's truck was packed except for the few things she'd need that morning. By noon, she'd be gone. They drove to the jewelry store in heavy silence. Mrs. Chen had the rings ready, nestled in a simple box. Back outside, standing beside Marian's truck, they exchanged them. With this ring, Ethan said, sliding the silver band onto her finger, I promise to wait for you, to work every day to be worthy of what you're offering me, to build a life here that you'll want to be part of. Marian's eyes filled with tears as she slipped the matching ring onto his finger. With this ring, I promise to come back to you, to trust in what we have even when distance makes it hard, to believe that some things are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth choosing every single day. They kissed, long and deep, neither caring that they were standing on Main Street where anyone could see. This was their moment, their commitment, their choice. The drive back to the ranch felt too short. Marion's departure was scheduled for 1 o'clock. She wanted to get several hours of driving in before stopping for the night. Every minute that ticked by felt like theft, time stolen from them by obligation and reality. "I should go," Marion said finally, standing beside her truck with her hand on the door handle. "If I wait any longer, I won't be able to leave at all." "Then don't leave. Stay. We'll figure it out." "You know I can't. Those kids are counting on me." She touched his face, gentle and loving. "But in 4 months, I'll be back. And then nothing will separate us again." He pulled her into his arms one last time, memorizing the feel of her, the scent of her hair, the way she fit perfectly against his chest. "I love you, Marion Hale. I love you, Ethan Cole. Don't forget that. Not for a single day." She climbed into the truck, and he stepped back, giving her room to maneuver. The engine started with a rumble. She looked at him through the window, tears streaming down her face, and he felt his own eyes burn. And then she was driving away, dust rising in her wake, the truck growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Ethan stood there long after she'd gone, staring at the empty road, the silver ring on his finger catching the sunlight. The house felt cavernous without her. He wandered through the rooms, seeing traces of her presence everywhere. A coffee mug she'd used that morning still in the sink, one of her hair ties on the bathroom counter, the indent in the pillow where she'd slept. The silence was oppressive, threatening to pull him back into the isolation he'd worked so hard to escape. But he'd made her a promise, and more than that, he'd made a promise to himself. He wasn't that man anymore, the one who retreated from pain, who built walls instead of bridges. He'd learned something in the past week, something Marion had taught him through her courage and her presence. That being alone and being at peace were not the same thing. That vulnerability was not weakness but strength. That love, real, honest, brave love, was worth every risk. The 4 months that followed were the longest and shortest of Ethan's life. Time moved differently when every day was measured by the distance between morning and the evening phone call with Marion. He fell into a rhythm, worked the ranch during the day, pushing himself physically to stave off the loneliness, then evenings spent on video calls where they'd share the details of their days. He told her about expanding the cattle herd, about hiring a part-time hand to help with the workload, about slowly becoming a regular at the community gatherings. She told him about her students' progress, about the science fair and the spring play, about the apartment she'd already given notice on because she wouldn't need it come summer. They had their rough patches, days when the distance felt insurmountable, when phone calls weren't enough and the need for physical presence was overwhelming, nights when doubts crept in, when fear whispered that they were crazy to think this could work. But they talked through it, honest and open, refusing to let silence build walls between them. Ethan made the drive to Oregon twice, spending long weekends in Marion's small apartment, meeting her friends and visiting her classroom. He saw her in her element, surrounded by children who adored her, and fell in love with her all over again. She came to California for spring break, and he introduced her to every inch of the ranch, making plans for where they'd expand when she moved in permanently. And slowly, steadily, they built something real, not based on proximity or convenience, but on choice, on actively deciding every single day that what they had was worth the effort. Ethan also did something he'd been thinking about since the day Marion left. He mailed the letter to Rebecca, sending it to the last address he had for her with a note asking it be forwarded if she'd moved. He didn't expect a response. Didn't need one, really. The act of sending it was closure enough. But 6 weeks later, a letter arrived. Rebecca's handwriting, precise and familiar. Inside was a single page, and Ethan read it with Marion on video call, holding his phone so she could see his face. "Dear Ethan," the letter began, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. For 5 years I've been carrying the weight of what I did, convinced I'd destroyed both our lives with my cowardice. Learning that you found happiness, real happiness, is the greatest gift you could have given me. I'm glad you found Marion. She sounds wonderful, and she must be, to have helped you heal from the damage I caused. I won't insert myself back into your life. I've caused enough pain, but I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. I found a good therapist, and I'm slowly learning to forgive myself. Maybe someday I'll even find what you've found. Until then, I wish you both every happiness. You deserve it. Thank you for loving me once and for finding the strength to move on. With gratitude and regret, Rebecca. Ethan set the letter down, feeling something inside him settle. This was the true ending to that chapter of his life. Not bitter or angry, but gentle and accepting. Rebecca was okay. He was okay. They'd both survived their grief, found their separate paths forward. How do you feel? Marion asked from the phone screen. Free, he said simply. I feel free. The months passed. March became April, April became May, and then suddenly it was June. Marion's last day of school. Her apartment was packed, everything she wanted to keep already loaded into a moving truck. She'd said her goodbyes to colleagues and students, had promised to write and visit when she could, and then she was driving south, away from the life she'd known, toward the life she'd chosen, toward Ethan and the ranch and a future they'd build together. He waited for her at the gate, the same gate where she'd appeared 7 months ago carrying letters and truth and the courage to change his life. When her truck came into view, his heart leaped. When she stopped and climbed out, running to him, he caught her in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. You came back, he said unnecessarily. I promised I would. She kissed him deep and sure. I'm home, Ethan. I'm finally home. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by neighbors and friends, by Tom and Margaret and Martha from the diner, by the community that had welcomed Marion as one of their own. She wore a simple white dress, and he wore his best suit, and when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Marion found a teaching position at the elementary school in town, a 20-minute drive from the ranch. The house they slowly expanded, adding a room that could serve as her office, and someday maybe a nursery. They talked about adoption, about fostering, about all the ways they could build the family they both wanted. There was no rush. They had time. The ranch thrived under their combined care. Ethan taught Marion everything he knew about cattle and horses, and she brought fresh perspectives that improved efficiency. They worked side by side during the day and fell asleep tangled together at night, and it was the life neither of them had dared to hope for. On their first anniversary, they stood together on the ridge where Ethan had first brought her, looking out over the land they'd claimed as theirs. The sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible colors. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked. Leaving Oregon? Giving up the life you had? Marion turned to him with a smile that was pure joy. Not for a single second. That wasn't living, Ethan. It was just existing. This, us, the ranch, the life we've built, this is living. I love you, he said, the words as natural as breathing now. I love you too. She leaned into him and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Thank you for letting me in, for being brave enough to try again. Thank you for showing up at my gate that day, for refusing to let me stay buried in my past, for choosing me. 2 years later, they welcomed their first foster child, a 6-year-old girl named Sophie who'd been through more trauma than any child should endure. Marion's experience with students and Ethan's patient gentleness created a safe haven, and slowly, Sophie began to heal. When the opportunity came to adopt her permanently, they didn't hesitate. Sophie was the first, but not the last. Over the years, they opened their home to other children who needed stability and love. Some stayed temporarily, finding their way back to biological families or other relatives. Others, like Sophie, became permanent parts of their family. The house rang with laughter and occasional tears, with homework struggles and bedtime stories, with all the beautiful chaos of a life fully lived. And through it all, Ethan never forgot where it started. Never forgot the night Marion appeared at his gate carrying letters that changed everything. Never forgot that healing could come from the most unexpected places, that love could bloom in the ruins of loss, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to reach for them. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, he and Marion would sit on the porch where this had all begun. Sometimes they'd talk about the past, about Rebecca and the baby they'd lost, about Marion's first marriage and the pain they'd both endured. But mostly, they'd talk about the present and the future, about dreams they were building together, about the life they'd chosen over and over again. Do you think Rebecca knows? Marion asked once, years into their marriage. About all this? About how happy we are? I hope so, Ethan said. I hope she's found her own happiness somewhere. She deserves that much. We all do, Marian agreed. Deserve happiness, I mean. Deserve second chances and unexpected grace and the courage to start over. Is that what we did? Started over? She considered the question. No. I think we started fresh. There's a difference. Starting over implies erasing the past, pretending it didn't happen. But starting fresh means acknowledging everything that came before and choosing to build something new anyway. Taking the lessons and the scars and the wisdom and using them to create something better. Ethan pulled her closer, marveling as he often did at how completely she understood him, understood life, understood what mattered. When did you get so wise? When I stopped running from pain and started walking toward hope. She kissed him softly. Same as you. Years passed, marked by children growing and graduating, by cattle sold and fences mended, by quiet moments and loud celebrations, by all the thousand small joys that make up a life well lived. The ranch became legendary in the community, not for its size or production, but for being a place where broken things were made whole, where children learned that they were worthy of love, where two people who'd been wounded by life had found each other and built something beautiful. On his 60th birthday, surrounded by their children, biological or not, it didn't matter, and grandchildren who were just beginning to arrive, Ethan stood on the porch and looked out over the land he loved. Marian stood beside him, silver threading through her dark hair now, laugh lines framing her eyes, more beautiful than ever. Any regrets? She asked, echoing his question from years ago. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, the pain of losing Rebecca and the baby he'd never known, the 5 years of isolation, the night Marian appeared with letters and truth, the courage it had taken to love again, to trust again, to believe that happiness was possible. Not a single one, he said. This life, our life, it's better than anything I could have imagined. Even on the hard days? Especially on the hard days. Because the hard days taught us how strong we are together. She smiled and took his hand, the silver ring she'd worn for decades catching the light. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their family gathered on the lawn below, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, watching the life they'd built unfold before them. This was the life they'd chosen. Not born from loss, though loss had shaped them. Not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something entirely its own. A life built on honesty and courage, on showing up every day and choosing love even when it was scary, on believing that broken things could be made whole if handled with enough care. What had begun with forgiveness had grown into grace. What had started with pain had transformed into joy. What had felt like an ending had become the most beautiful beginning. And as the sun set over the California hills, painting everything gold, Ethan Cole knew beyond any doubt that every moment of pain, every year of loneliness, every tear and struggle had been worth it, because it had all led him here, to this porch, to this woman, to this life that was more than he'd ever dared to hope for. Some stories don't have happy endings, but this one did, and it was real, and it was earned, and it was exactly what both of them deserved. The end.